See if he gets on the audio. Hey,
Hi,
how are you?
I'm great. Good to see
Happy
you.
Wednesday.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, we're so happy to have you. Right on the dot here, we have 14 participants live with us from around the world. I heard the one guy's on the Antonio is on the beach in the Caribbean. We have
Perfect.
someone who's called in from the DRC. And if anybody else wants to shout out their location, that would be amazing. But everybody is here across all different time zones and all parts of the world to hear from you, Ethan, about this subject that we all care so much about, which is the circular economy of food, and importantly, how we can measure it. So these live sessions are, part of our Digital Labs program, which is there to help, catalyze and accelerate startups in the food and agricultural space. And this year, as everyone knows, we've partnered with the Food Lab Accelerator at Google to launch a specific topical challenge around circular economy of food. And we've been pulling together these live sessions to really learn from the experts who are part of the, FLAG network, so that we can really more deeply understand exactly what it means, circular economy of food, what kind of solutions are needed in this space, and of course, the topic of today, how we can measure success so that we can really scale our impact. And this is going to be a recorded session. So we have the live participants today who are going to be asking questions, hopefully all kinds of exciting ones, and sharing a little bit about their products through the chat, which we can see and we will touch on. But we also, like I said, will record this and make it available on the Digital Lab, so anyone, anywhere can watch this at any time and learn about this topic, so that they can take their project into this direction, which is really exciting because we want everybody to be thinking in circular principles, right? So before we dive into this, I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about yourself, Ethan, because you have such an interesting background being, a farmer and traveled the world, looking at things like biodiversity. So tell us about, your passion and what you're up to these days.
Great. Yeah. So I am based in upstate New York in the USA, a couple hours north of New York City. I'm a small scale farmer. So my wife and I manage a 30-acre diversified farm that primarily focuses on apples, but also grows sheep, grass-fed sheep and lamb, and shiitake mushrooms, log-grown shiitake mushrooms. So we keep our hands busy and in the dirt. And that really keeps me real and connected to both the reality, really difficult, but then also to sort of see the impacts on the ground of different agricultural practices, and moreover of the sourcing decisions, the buying decisions that so many of the food product and health and beauty and other product companies, but all of the companies in the world that are making sourcing decisions about where to buy their stuff, what standards to apply to it, what they're asking for. We really feel that as small farmers, and bring that experience to my day-to-day work, which is with How Good. How Good is a venture-backed startup in the sustainability space that focuses on data and analytics. We have an intelligence platform that assesses food products primarily, but also health and beauty and cleaning products. All over the world, we have over 1 million products in our database. It's the world's largest product sustainability database. Okay. And we assess products according to 127 different sustainability indicators, drawing from a huge amount of data. We have 385 different data sources and certifications that we're pulling from. And so my role here is Chief Innovation Officer. So I am tasked with taking this massive database and making it really useful and putting it in the hands of those who can make decisions to make the world a better place.
And so really quick question for clarification. So this intelligence platform, How Good, does it, so it's like helps you understand if you're certified for like a major certification label, or does it have its own certification, or what's the
No, okay. So there's no, we don't have our own certification because there's already 400 different certifications that are out there. We didn't think that was a useful place to interact. What we do is we analyze all those 400 different certifications and a huge amount of other information and data, and we sort of summarize it and make it really simple and easy to use. So some of our partners are retailers. And so the retailers license a very, very high level rolled up. It's like if you roll up those 127 indicators into just a very simple, like good, great, or best for the world. These are these like high level tags just to get a sense. And they actually put them on shelf in the supermarket so that shoppers can just quickly, instead of just looking at price, they can look at how good is this for the world
absolutely.
right at the same time. And go ahead.
No, that's really interesting. And funny that you say that, because the other day, actually, my husband brought home a bag of potato chips that had that like ABC ranking of like good or bad. Nutrition, right. So anyway, I kind of am envisioning what you're talking about from the environmental.
We take nutrition into account. We take environmental, we take social, we take animal welfare, we take greenhouse, like we get everything and roll it up into one simple thing. That's only half of what we do. Our other partners are some of the larger food companies in the world that are producing, thousands of different products, and they need a rapid way to assess, okay, for this formulation or for this set of sourcing materials and this set of ingredients, how sustainable is this product? How far towards supporting a circular economy of food does this product go? According to all these different metrics, from water to greenhouse gases, et cetera. And we'll look at some of those metrics today. And so part of the platform that we provide as a service is to give product developers detailed insight for each of the ingredients, for each of their products. How sustainable is it? But then also, how does it line up against their competition? So because we have so many products in the database, we can, put your, your granola or your yogurt or your plant-based burger and compare it to other plant-based burgers or compare it to conventional burgers, so you can see what the overall impact is.
Cool. Do you publicize that, or is that just like for your partners to have as proprietary information?
So there's a software as a service tool that gives a like real deep specific insights about that. But then we'll often present and make that information available. You can get actually a simple version of it pretty quickly. There is a smartphone app you can download to barcode scan products and search. And so a large amount of our data is just freely available to the world to get and make use of, but more from a consumer standpoint. And not with the full like depth and geekiness that we might get into today, of really having insight into all these different metrics.
So are you a data nerd? Like, how did you get into this?
Big time. I'm definitely a geek in the best way. Though my route into it, let's see, I guess the best thing to say is that at university, I studied biochemistry. And so I did get a lot of kind of like deep, specific, geeky science there. But I also felt like it wasn't enough. Like I was in a laboratory for 4 years and I got a biology degree, but the largest thing I studied was like a yeast cell or a fruit fly. And it didn't feel like biology. And so when I graduated, I was fortunate enough to apply for and win a fellowship that allowed me to travel around the world and study something much bigger, which was apples. So I went all around the world and studied the global diversity of apples, from Sweden to Kazakhstan to Japan, New Zealand, Chile, working with scientists, working with farmers, and just really understanding in a more holistic way, what are the effects of agriculture on the world? What are the opportunities that are there?
And so I've seen some studies that we've like really limited the genetic diversity of apples, but this is coming back, right? Because of heirloom breeding or things like this, or is that not so much that, well,
I wish we could say it's coming back. There is some resurgence in awareness of it in some places, but there's 23,000 varieties of apples, named varieties of apples in the world, not to mention the unnamed ones. And of those, probably, I think 10, 12, maybe 15 are sold commercially in a significant way. And so we've got a ways to go on that level of kind of cultivated crop biodiversity, even within apples and well beyond apples as well.
Oh my goodness. So much we could go. So this is the beauty of the digital labs, and our partner network is like, we could have an AMA with you every week if we wanted to on all kinds of topics. But let's dive into what the focus of today is, which is really how to measure circular economy of food. I want to start with just a really basic question. And I've asked everybody who's involved in this challenge, this question, but what is, in your own words, the circular economy of food? And, what does a good project in this vein look like to you?
My perspective is that a circular economy of food has the whole food product life cycle, every aspect of the production, of the manufacturing, of the transportation, all the different aspects, and have a little diagram we can put up to look at that more in detail. The whole system that produces the food has a positive impact on ecological and social systems. And so that's a little different than sometimes the idea of circular. People think it's like a net zero. Okay. Like circular means like circle is a zero. So it's like net zero, like no harm done, net like sustainable, no good. No, that to me is not enough to actually get to a circular economy. And I think this is the other thing that's really key to think about in this sort of definition. People will use a shorthand of like, oh, it's circular food. And that doesn't quite communicate enough of the system. Saying circular food, first of all, people get confused. Yeah, and go, wait,
donut?
Like you mean a donut, tortilla, orange? What do you mean circular? So it's really important in our language to be saying circular economy of food, because that immediately makes us see that it's the economy that we're working towards a circularity. But when it gets to food, it's not as simple as like with plastics or packaging materials where you want to like recycle it over and over again, use it over and over again. It is more circular. With food, you're engaging with living systems. And so you immediately have to stretch your mind beyond, like circles don't even exist in nature.
Right.
Really.
It's like networks.
Exactly. It's more of a web. It's more of a network. And so we have to be thinking in that systemic way in order to achieve positive impact.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I'm already thinking of some visuals here, but this sounds really, really complicated. And in our discussion with Scott May, we talked about this, because how does someone in a startup, right, who is trying to solve a particular problem for a particular, challenge in their market segment, how do they think about circular economy of food, which is so big and vast and systems wide? Can they do that?
Yeah. Just do it. We're humans. We have this incredible brain capacity. You will be more effective at solving a focused, targeted problem if you are holding the system. Mm-hmm. If you can see the whole system as much as you can, you don't have to be perfect, you don't have to go all the way, but as much as you can see and understand the particular problem you're trying to solve within its context, within that context, that will help so much to actually solve the problem.
So to get started, what's the first step? Is it to like download some of these systems thinking tools and things like that?
It differs for every different startup that's out there. I mean, I think one thing that's really useful is to have pictures. You might call it a framework, a little bit different than a model, but a sort of picture that allows you to see the whole right away, that you can just glance at it in a page and be like, oh, okay. I have to consider I have to consider all these things, or I see all these things. Here's where we're working. And here's where we can be effective. So you don't need to know everything about everything, but if you can see the big picture and understand where you are inserting a solution, where you are intervening in the system, then that's usually where I would start. That's part of why when we were working with the Food Lab in the last the first cohort, that one of the first things we did is we developed this diagram that I think pretty quickly and easily share here to sort of show an overview of the food product life cycle. Right. So let me just share screen.
And for everybody too that's on the call, this diagram he's referring to is actually available on a slide that we're incorporating into the pitch submissions, right, that go into the circular economy of food price. So you'll see this. But this is even great. Yeah.
Is that up there?
Yes, it is. Perfect.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. So here's the food product life cycle. This is not the only diagram. This is not truth. This is a map. So you got to remember that this is a map, and the map is not the actual territory. And in some ways, it's much more complex than this. But we think that putting it in this way really will help to focus in and clarify and help you understand where you're working, and maybe even the hope is to say, maybe I could expand where I'm working in order to have a more positive impact.
Yeah.
So, should I just walk us through this quickly?
Yeah, that would be fantastic. And with the lens of like, okay, well, one question I was going to ask is like when to get started with thinking about measurement, but I'm guessing you would say as soon as possible.
When to get started thinking about measurement? I mean, for this project, for these submissions that you all are working on, yes, you should be thinking about measurement for sure right now. I would not necessarily, in general, when I was formulating a new product or a new service or something, I wouldn't necessarily start with measurement. I'd more try to look at I'd look at this system and ask, where am I uniquely positioned to intervene in this system for the greatest possible good?
Okay, that's a great question to start with, everyone. Step one, where am I uniquely positioned to intervene? Step two, walk us through this, but if you could just like add in that lens of like how to think about measurement, right? And where you're making impact as you're explaining it, that would be super helpful.
Absolutely. So this is pretty straightforward. In some ways you could say it starts with, but you can really start anywhere. There's a food production step, and whether that's from farming, fishing, or extracting in some way, or gathering, and that then moves on to processing. But there's this little thing where it goes through the quote unquote supply chain. Now, I'll just say here, I don't actually believe that supply chains exist. I wrote a little article that I can share with you that basically says the chain is actually an old colonial metaphor that is because we actually used to put people in chains to supply our goods, and that has actually never left the language. However, there aren't actually chains. It's a web, it's a network, as we've already spoken to. Living systems, there are no chains in living systems, and yet we still have this language, which is fascinating. So anyway, that said, food is produced, it goes through, I usually call it a supply system. It goes through a supply system in order to arrive at wherever it is processed. This is sort of the initial processing of a good. Let's say you're growing a coconut. The processing the coconut might be shelling and drying the coconut. Then again, it's going through this sort of supply system to a step where you're actually doing some conversion or manufacturing, getting it together. So you're taking the coconut, you're taking some sugar that came from somewhere else, you're taking a flavor for somewhere else, and you're converting it, you're manufacturing the actual finished product. And there's different impacts at those different stages. From the product, then you've got to put it in a package, unless you're just presenting it. That's why this is there, also thinking a bit for food service, like maybe that this creation conversion step is in a kitchen in a restaurant somewhere, and then you're putting it out on a plate. That is the sort of presenting or packaging. But in most cases for consumer packaged goods, it gets packaged, and then that packaging, again, we're moving through the supply system. There's some transportation, there's some warehousing. At some point it's at retail, where it's actually bought by a customer or served in a restaurant. And then there's the actual step of sort of preparing it, eating, experiencing it in some way, shape, or form, after which there's sort of a choice with what happens with the materials that are left over, the food that's left over. A lot of it is wasted. Some of it, recently, there's some really exciting companies that are doing some upcycling of the food products, especially. And then there's another path where you can either compost it or turn it into animal feed or biodigest it, in some way kind of return the nutrients back into the food and farming production system. So that step, that's the post-use step. In a way, you think, oh, well, that only happens here. So there's these three arrows here. But actually, if you think about it, that little set of three things is happening at each stage along the process. So at each point, there's the opportunity to waste, to upcycle, or to sort of return the nutrients back into the system. So you quickly see that this nice, simple circle diagram becomes and speaks to more of a web as a whole. And yet I still think it's valuable to see it in this sort of circular economy diagram in order to quickly understand and say, okay, where am I primarily working?
So before the call started tonight, we heard from Antonio, the guy who was on the beach in the Caribbean, rubbing it in while we're sitting in the cold of Europe. But he was mentioning that he has a circular business that's producing mushrooms from waste products from the rum industry. So like with that, business and not knowing any more than that, like how does he jump in here? To think about, all of the
great.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a cool question. So basically, it's taking the spent grains, or most likely grains, that's going into produce the rum, and so it's sort of in a way, you could say it's upcycling that material. It's not just composting or biodigesting it. It's taking from the processing step, or maybe it's even so the grains have to be produced somewhere, then they're dried and malted, and then the sort of conversion to rum happens here, and then there's a little arrow that goes off to the side that might be waste, except this gentleman is taking it and actually growing mushrooms on it, which is amazing. And so this is taking what would otherwise be a waste stream and turning it and putting it back into the actual food production step.
Cool. Okay.
And so there's a couple different ways to think about it there in terms of the metrics that you would use. But you can see obviously that there's an aspect of upcycling that's happening to produce a new good there. There's greenhouse gas emissions that are sort of diverted because that grain is not just going to a landfill. Although it's interesting to think about, what happens to that grain. Usually most distilleries and breweries they're not just throwing it out or throwing it in a landfill. They're, selling it to animals for feed, or in some cases composting it, though that's less often. But it seems like it's going to a higher value and use right away.
Do you weigh that differently? Like if it goes to animals versus if it's going to produce like a crop like mushrooms? Like how do you know what I mean? Like how do you compare what is more sustainable in the end? This can get really complicated, I guess, right? Or is that not the point? It's not really about.
Well, no, I mean, it's a good question. How do you compare it is a great question to ask. I think, so I'm forgetting who put this out. There is a diagram that sort of shows, maybe it's from Refed or from one of the other food waste groups, that has a hierarchy of what they believe is highest and best use of the material. And I believe that from that, somehow getting it back into use as food is a higher value than just giving it to animals to feed, especially when you're doing a fungal-based protein source for this particular example, where that is going to be a much higher efficiency production of protein than feeding to a pig who will also turn it into protein, but
in a more inefficient.
A bit more inefficient way to look at it. Yep.
Fascinating. So Antonio actually is like listening in. So he just wrote, yes, he's using bagasse, which is waste from rum. Mushrooms can be grown in that.
Sugar
and
cane,
waste from growing mushrooms is then used as fertilizer in farming. So that is pretty like integrated, which is great.
That's awesome.
And then, another participant who works in the food production industry asked, how do you see the processors in the circular economy?
Well, great opportunity for processors. Because it's a little harder for a processor to have a net positive impact. So a lot of the work of processors one way to look at it is processors are essential for the running of the current global food system. And even before global capitalism as we currently know it, some level of processing always happened, anywhere in the world, in any indigenous food system. There was processing. Often it was lower energy, right? It was fermented or was dried over fire. Like there's many really cool forms of processing that are low energy input. That's the main metric to pay attention to for processors in thinking about circular economy of food, is what is the non-renewable energy use of the processing that you're doing. Right. So somebody who's and a particular metric, and I think that's on the next slide, we can kind of get to it. I love these little examples, they're great, but the metric would be something like megajoules of energy used, or joules or calories of energy used to do the processing of either that ingredient or that finished product. And so the sort of directive for a processor is, can I become more efficient? So can I reduce the energy, through various methods? Can I increase the efficiency of my processing so that I'm using less energy as I go? But then also there's all these interesting opportunities where it's like, okay, can what I'm processing actually, any byproducts from it, be used for something else? The rum, to mushrooms example is a great one with the bagasse, that's actually from sugarcane and being used for something more valuable. The other thing for processors is to figure out renewable energy sources for the processing that they're doing in terms of just the circular economy of food metrics, figuring out how to be net zero through using renewable energy, or maybe you're using renewable energy to do the processing, but then you're composting the byproducts and putting that compost out, or giving it to a farmer, then that's actually sequestering carbon on their farm. And so now we're getting into a situation where it's towards the positive.
And you're actually like really bringing a lot of color and life to a great point that Scott made last week about circular economy. It's like a mindset, not a destination. And like the point is, you kind of always have to be pushing yourself in whatever part of the food system you're playing to be thinking, asking these questions on an ongoing basis, because you can always get better with like each new innovation that comes your way, or each new, I guess, like capability to measure, etc. There's always going to be something new. And I asked the provocative question about corn, actually, because we were talking about a specific example from Mista, where one particular crop there were like multiple uses. You could use, the seed, extract, some element from it that could be used for different materials. And then, there was just like every part of this crop from Brazil was being used for a variety of different purposes. And it just reminds me, thinking back to my early days in ag, corn was like, oh yeah, we're going to make everything from corn. We can sweeten things. We can make, plastic from it. It's going to make fuel. It's going to replace oil, et cetera. It's so sustainable. But of course, then we look at like its production, cropping and monocultures and, all of these kind of like not using irrigations and things like this. So it's just a little bit of like, it's not just about using every part of whatever growing.
I think, and I love that story, because I think one of the key issues there is that, and the reason that I'm putting this diagram up first and staying at the beginning, see the whole system, is you can hone in on any individual step here and attempt to optimize for that step. But you may do that in a way that doesn't take into account the larger system. And so it may be, right? It may be that you're really focusing on processing and or the step of not having any waste from corn, right? Use every part of it, but you're not recognizing that the actual biggest impact is from how you're growing the corn. So it's good to be more efficient by utilizing all of it, but it would be better to go back to this food production stage. And I'll actually just step out and say, for all food products, the vast majority of the time, the vast majority of the impact is in the food production stage.
And we actually talked about that too, because you can imagine for some of these new food crops that are becoming more exciting because they have, regenerative properties, or because they, can find these like multiple uses, etc. I mean, one question I have is like, as this scales, are we going to be pushed into, like bad production practices, or, what I mean?
Not if you see the whole system.
Right. And that's exactly. Right. That's why we have to think like this, so we don't get into that trap.
Exactly. And over and over again, where we should start is at food production, is, because just 40 to 70% of the impact of overall food product will often come from the food production step. These other steps, the transportation, sure, that has an impact. Usually it's between 5 to 9% of the overall, greenhouse gas emissions of a product comes from the transportation. Packaging, everybody's really excited about packaging right now, and I can understand why. There's some very tangible reasons for, everybody ends up with the packaging and the plastic in the ocean, and it is a significant challenge and issue for marine life, et cetera. If you look from a greenhouse gas perspective, packaging is usually a really, really, really small percentage of the overall impact of the food. So you might, improve the efficiency of your packaging by 70% or by 80 or 90%, but only improve the greenhouse gas footprint of your overall product by 1 or 2% by doing it. And so if you're looking,
sorry.
I was just going to say, if you're looking for leverage points for change in the system, often you'll find yourself looking upstream to food production.
And that's why we're seeing, I mean, in this era where finally, you know, because I think in large part, thanks to the millennial and Gen Z consumer, we're starting to see real change happening even by big food incumbents, right? Who are starting to like put their money where their mouth is when it comes to sustainability and regenerative and circular economy of food. And they're actually vertically integrating, I see, you know, more and more so that they have a bit more control around food production. Do you agree with that? And I'm like, do you see that happening too, I guess? And then even more specifically, are you seeing enough attention being paid, for example, to biodiversity, going back to like your crop genetic diversity?
No, not enough. I think at risk of drawing the ire of everyone who's spending really good time and attention on packaging, I think if we shifted all of our attention from packaging, all the resources that are pouring into packaging right now, and focused on biodiversity, focused on this sort of food production side, we'd be moving much faster towards, you know, the global ambitions and targets on greenhouse gases, on climate change, and the larger threat that is. It's not to say we should do one or the other. Of course, they're all important, and we should be putting resources in. But I would prefer that we put resources into solutions in the proportion of the impact that they cause. Does that make sense? So if packaging is, you know, 7% of the impact of a product or a product category, 7% of the resources towards sustainability should go to packaging, and the 50% that's in the food should go there. And that is lopsided right now.
Right. Why do you think that is? Do you have a hypothesis? Is it?
It's packaging is smaller and easier.
Right. It's easier to tangible, get like a fast impact. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's tangible. It's right. It's in consumers' hands. It's like, it's right there.
Right.
There's been some great marketing on the side of the ocean, you know, coalition, like to make this a really tangible, heartfelt, emotional thing that we should work on. I think they've been very effective. Also, food production's it's tough.
It is. Well,
making changes there, shifting to net positive agriculture in that realm. There's a lot of global agriculture, both large scale and small scale, that for very good reasons are conservative and slow to change. And so
and also I think it's really hard to understand how to, like, when it comes to packaging, it's like, okay, plastic bad, you know, biomaterial good. Like food production, it's like, is biotech good or bad? Is, you know, organic good or bad? There's a lot of different places to find different information about the pros and cons of each and how they work in different systems, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's also like extremely confusing for a consumer and an innovator to actually know where to play. And that's actually taking me to my next question, which is then, okay, measurement, you know, in food production, there's a lot of certification, but I've been reading that many of these certification schemes are losing their luster a little bit because they're not, well, you know, maybe some technologies like blockchain will change this, but they're not necessarily, you know, accurate, et cetera. So I wanted to just get your input a little bit on two things. One is the role of technology, right, in circular economy of food. And the second thing is like data. How do we like ensure it's verifiable and trust, you know, the data that is coming into this very complex system?
Okay. Cool. I'm going to respond to two questions you didn't ask.
Okay. I like that.
One is that while there is some complexity on the food production end, that debate is kind of ending now. Like from our perspective, at least, and what we're seeing, and by the massive swing of so many large leading corporations towards regenerative agriculture, we actually have enough science and data to know what the best production practices are. There's still little nitpicking things about like should you organic no-till or should you chemical no-till, and like which one's better there? But you know what? There's many places where you shouldn't even be tilling in the first place, and that science is clear, right? We know that we can capture carbon in the ground, in biomass, and there's a time-tested set of agricultural systems and technologies that do that really, really well. And the vested interests that make their money off of the current agrochemical dominant system are slow to switch and support, for example, in the tropics, multi-story agroforestry systems that are much more productive in nutrition, in calories, way, way, way less inputs, and simultaneously sequester carbon. So that debate, especially with the rise of interest in biodiversity, this is going to move a lot faster. And a lot of these questions that I think have been around for a little while will end. And so I'll use that as a way to go towards your questions. I think that there are some key metrics, and definitely before we get done here today, I'll flip to that next slide and sort of lay out the metrics for each of these 8 phases of the food product life cycle, because these are the ones that from our end on the circular economy of food team, they're the ones we're recommending that you consider as sort of the primary metric depending on where you're working. And if you're working on a product that has a number of these different steps, these are the metrics that we're recommending, to have some unity across the field, that you look at and use these metrics, while also being excited to hear what metrics you think of. And we're not all knowing it all, and we're excited for other metrics as well. Okay, so I'll take that, and then we'll get to that, but let's do technology, role of technology, and then what was the other part?
What was the other part? It was, oh my gosh. Certification schemes.
Certifications. Okay. Let's see. I'll hit certifications first. So there's too many certifications out there. There's 400 that you can use. They all have different purposes. Navigating amongst them can be a little confusing. The issue with most certifications, so we're in big support of certifications. We like them. There's the third-party verification. There is a trend towards bigger companies doing their own certification schemes, which I think is part of the erosion in the trust of the third-party systems, and I'm not hugely in support of most of the time. However, the issue with all certifications, activist, NGO, corporate, is that they are primarily not based on outcomes. They're not based on actual measurements and metrics of what's happening. Is more carbon going into the soil?
Right.
Is less greenhouse gases being produced? Is less energy being used? Like they are practice-based certifications. So like organic basically says, did you till or not? Did you use synthetic pesticides or not? It's a long checklist of what you're supposed to do and not do, but it's not looking at the outcomes that occur once you actually do them. So there's finally a new set of certifications coming out that I'm very excited about from the regenerative agriculture angle. The first one that's been launched so far is called a land to market certification. That's from the Savory Institute. And that is the first holistic ecological outcomes verification system that's come to market. So I'm excited about that.
That's awesome.
Though it's limited.
So that's like technology neutral. That's like totally outcomes based.
It's outcomes based. That is the key. And that's what we should all be focusing on and learning how to measure. There is some science to catch up, and there are a huge amount of resources going into specific science for aspects of that, and that's good. The other one that's coming out is called the Soil Carbon Initiative. They'll be announcing stuff later this year, and that's another outcomes based for carbon in soils. This is a really positive move for certifications overall, because it's moving us to, what actually happens as the result of whatever you do. Right. Not prescriptively saying you have to do this, you have to do that, because that can stifle innovation.
Absolutely. We talk a lot about too the need for more collaboration and openness and sharing. And what I think is really exciting here is that you could also foster culture very analogous to what we saw in like the software industry, where people were like, okay, we're trying to get here, but like, let's all talk to each other about how to get there. And, I tried this, did you try this, et cetera. And, it could really like excite a whole new innovation culture in food and
definitely. When you're focused on outcomes, it gets really exciting. And the other thing that I love about these is that none of these are about doing less harm.
Yeah.
They're all about positive impact.
Doing better. Yes.
Not even doing better, because you can still be really, really terrible and do a little better.
That's true. Yeah.
They are about positive impact, and how do we achieve positive impact in whatever we're doing. And that is a real shift, to go from making more efficient, optimizing, doing less harm,
right,
to aiming for positive outcomes and having a concrete way to track that. Is, if you are losing carbon from your soil every year, it doesn't matter if you become 50% or 80% more efficient, you're still losing carbon from your soil.
Right.
It's when you start adding carbon to the soil every year, adding biodiversity, adding species to the agricultural ecosystem you're working in, biodiversity is then increasing. Right?
That's such a great point, teams. Everybody listening, like, it's not just about doing better. It's actually like, we're going for positive impact. That's where transformation happens. That's amazing.
It's got to be there, because improving 90% on the number of species we're killing, so we're only killing 10. Like, that's not good enough.
And we don't have time for that.
We don't have time for that.
That's great. Well, you said you had another slide to show us. So
yes. Okay. And then I'll make sure to hit a little more on the technology side as we do it. Okay.
Oh yeah.
So here are the metrics version 1.0 from a sort of agile perspective. We're like, this is version 1. They're going to improve over time. So here are the different phases of food production life cycle that we just went through, 1 through 8. And then here are the metrics that you would look at the product level for each of these phases. So on the food production one, it's the carbon emissions, this CO2 equivalent per unit produced. So like per box of crackers or per carton of mushrooms, what are the carbon emissions total that happen there? There's another interesting one that I like that this got in there. This is an input-based one as opposed to an outcome-based one. And it's not as good as the outcomes-based one, but it is an interesting input one that's actually pretty quick and easy to measure. And this one came at the recommendation of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation working on circular economy. Looking at the weight of synthetic versus organic isn't quite the right, biological agricultural inputs. That's one to do. For the supply chain, the metric is actually very similar. It's carbon emissions, CO2 equivalents per unit, right? So all of these actually can be rolled up to carbon. We've called carbon emissions a sort of master metric here, that if you just wanted to do one, that would be a good one to get some thinking and movement on. Processing, as we talked about, kilocalories of energy expended to create each unit. And so this is, again, you could, depending on the energy source, so if this is from fossil coal or if this is from solar photovoltaic, you might expend this much energy, but then you can convert that back to carbon emissions if you want to. So that's the one for processing. For some of these, the conversion manufacturing, this is one where we looked at percentage of waste weight. So this is waste that's not otherwise utilized from the process. At packaging, the metric is the percent of packaging that is reusable, recyclable, or compostable, or it already comes from renewable or recycled sources. I'll be honest, that's not quite as hardcore as I would want this one to be, but we did it to align with the World Benchmarking Alliance and what they just put out for packaging. My hardcore angle on it was like, I don't care if your packaging is recyclable. For me, this really gets back to carbon, and it says, where is the packaging from? Right. And like, if it's paper packaging and the packaging came from a regenerative forestry system that sequestered carbon, great. Then it could be virgin as far as I care. Right. It doesn't even have to be recycled or recyclable. It's coming from a system that is net positive to start with.
Ooh,
so
I like this.
I have a little bit different angle on this packaging one, but this is what the team agreed on. Okay, for both retailing and the preparing and eating, this is another repeat of this processing one, which is how many kilocalories of energy are expended per unit. This is an interesting one where, like, for pasta, the actual largest impact comes from the boiling water to cook the pasta.
Wait, what?
So it's not, this is an exception to what I was saying before. It's not in the wheat growing. It's not in the agrochemical inputs. It's not in the transportation. It's when you put a pot of water on your stove to boil it and cook the pasta, that is where the greatest carbon impact comes from. So in some cases, this becomes really interesting and important. And for those people who are working on, for example, more efficient stoves or stove systems that come from regenerative forestry setups, then that one becomes interesting.
Or pasta that can boil at a lower temperature. I mean, maybe that's possible. I don't know, but that's
sure.
This is highlighting, by the way, just something we talked about before in one of our previous sessions too, about really understanding these problems, not just how to measure them, but like why. For example, pasta is this, thing. I mean, understanding really how the systems work, I should say, can also elucidate innovation opportunities. Understanding the challenges is like, we can also think about directing innovation efforts into this space. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Cool. So the last one there is just that, the percent, whatever food is left over from the post-use that isn't somehow upcycled or sort of reused, reinvested into the system through composting, biodigestion, et cetera. Okay, so those are the metrics themselves. This part is really important. This is the sort of certainty modifiers. So especially for your teams, any of these metrics, you can sort of have 3 levels of certainty with it. One is you just claim it. So you say, yeah, I think because I'm doing this thing, it's going to have a positive, the carbon emissions per unit are 0.
Yeah.
That's great. And even saying that, at least you're then referring to a metric and starting to think about it.
Right.
More solid is if you calculate it. And you say, okay, here are the inputs. We know from, this paper or that paper that usually, the growing of sugarcane, I'll just use that example. The growing of sugarcane, emits 10 kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilogram of finished sugar or something like that. So you have that number and you say, based on that, we're using this many kilograms. And so we're calculating, even back of the envelope is fine. We're doing a little thoughtful calculation about what we think our carbon emissions are. Right? So that's the calculated level. The third level is verified. So here's where you have taken the time to do a life cycle assessment or have some third party, like you have a carbon neutral certification that somebody who really does the calculations well came and verified the kind of claim that you're making. All of them are good. Having a claim on one of these is better than not. If you can do some calculations, from my perspective, that becomes stronger. I don't think for this challenge we're in right now, it's necessary to get all the way to the verified level. If you happen to have done it, great. But I would my aim, if I were one of these teams, would be to work, from claims towards having some calculation based on, some data that's out there.
And what's, besides, of course, the positive impact we can make, on our food system, what's in it for these startups who are like, bootstrapping, time-strapped, all of this. So this sounds like a time-consuming endeavor to be thinking about this when you're just trying to like get your team together and like get a prototype build and customers and maybe a website, what else, like, what's in it for them? Like, do you see that this is a way to get investment? Well,
I mean, what we've seen is that in our How Good research, we looked at all 1 million products in our database, and we pulled the top 5,000 of those products that have gone the farthest towards circular economy principles, using, with these metrics and others. And then we said, how well are these doing in the market? And those products that have gone the farthest they're doing amazing. They're outperforming their categories by anywhere from 7 to 197%. And so that is to say that customers care. Like we are now at a time where the trend is towards these products. If you can I don't think this should take up a lot of your time midstream. I think where it should take up time is before you even start. You should be thinking about, okay, where do I want to have a positive impact? What could I design right from the beginning that has a higher likelihood of having a positive impact? And then designing products from that perspective. So if I'm going to start, I'm working on some food products myself right now as a little side thing. I'm going to only use crops that are from carbon sequestering tree crop agriculture. So right from the start, I know the chestnuts or the walnuts or the nuts I work with, that they're capturing carbon. I'm already in a great spot here. So I would say that's what's in it, is sort of the market trend is heading this way, and there's lots of research on this. NYU and IRI put out a study that we've showed the data from recently that basically sustainably marketed products are just going up and up and up in terms of
Mm-hmm.
sales, and they're growing in the speed at which they're growing every year. So I think there's a real, now I can say this, I couldn't have said this 5 years ago.
Yeah.
I think there's a real market imperative to be pushing your metrics towards this positive impact.
Sure.
And knowing a bit about it and having some credibility, even the credibility to say, yeah, I calculated this out. It's not perfect. I know I could do better, but here's the 3 sources I used, and we think it's this. Even that has a level of credibility that I think is valuable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I definitely do think in this, purpose economy that, especially when it comes to food, no matter where you are in that supply network, everyone's talking about the impact and the sustainability kind of metrics, et cetera. It's not even if you're just direct to consumer,
Absolutely. Yeah.
Everybody's asking these questions.
To your question about investors, we've done some work with investing firms who have basically asked us to say, how do we incorporate impact metrics into the financial metrics that we already use? So they don't want to take half their time on it, but if they're still going to look at the fundamentals of a company and of the solution and of the space, all of that, but they more and more want to know, how do I quickly and efficiently assess the impact of a product? And they're taking that into consideration as they're making investment decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
and back to your point though, about the fact that these are living systems and highly complex, I really couldn't agree more. And I think one of the things that's been, difficult in the world that we live in is it's been kind of built around industrial era efficiency, right? And so we're really changing everything. So we need to even go back to how people are educated, from the earliest years to be thinking in systems. It doesn't come naturally necessarily to people my age, because it's we are looking very much at chains and, and efficiencies and optimization, et cetera. And one of the things I'm just trying to get my head around too, and I really love your point about the outcomes based, but it's for me still really hard to think about, let's just take a very popular topic at the moment, which is alternative proteins, to think about how to measure, compare, and, get to a point where there's a positive impact. Because there's so many, I guess, ways to get there. And I just see, if you will, infighting happening, right, in the food community about should we be eating animals? Should we be growing in Petri dishes? Should we be all eating plants, et cetera? And I mean, as a person who's kind of expert in food and agriculture, I've spent my entire career and, studies in this space. If I'm confused, I can only imagine what an average person on the street, is feeling. So how do you, I don't know, how do you get, your head around these types of things? And to your point about nuts and chestnuts and everything, this is fantastic. But it's only going to feed one part of the diets, right, of people, I guess. Maybe not. Maybe you're finding all kinds of uses for it that are very innovative.
Well, I mean, I think if you look at the Eat Lancet report and their recommendations, that's a good thing that has broad scientific support and makes a lot of sense. And on that particular point, nuts can have a whole bunch of both carbohydrate and nutrient.
But I love nuts.
Your bigger point here, I think, is a good one. So for me, I actually don't think it's too complex. I think if you take the emotion out of it, and you choose a single, let's just talk about carbon. Let's say I've named it as sort of a possible master metric here. Let's just talk about carbon. And you say our goal is to have is to sequester carbon through the production of this food. So then it becomes very clear, if you lay out conventional meat and plant-based meat next to each other, you very quickly see conventional meat, by and large, produces a huge carbon footprint. And plant-based meat produces a lot less. And so, just simplify to that and say, I'll take the Impossible Burger or the Beyond Burger at Dunkin' Donut. I will and have started to make that choice because that is doing less harm. However, I then, if I see a grass-fed, organic, holistic management grazed beef burger that actually has the power to sequester carbon, which none of the plant-based meats have done, this meat can actually be grown in a way that captures carbon out of the atmosphere and increases biodiversity. So but let's just stick with carbon. So I'll now buy that regeneratively grazed burger over the plant-based burger because it actually gets to positive impact.
To a positive. I see. Fascinating.
So that's how I reconcile a number of these conversations and questions that are out there. I agree with you. There's too much infighting. There's too little seeing this whole spectrum, and just, being able to say, yeah, we want to go as fast as we can. The plant-based meat that's out there, I'm hugely in support because it's going to go so much faster and reach so many more people and get so much more efficient than the regeneratively grazed beef, for sure. At the same time, I am not in support of the amount of pesticides, the monoculture agriculture that's behind that, but that's okay. I still see it as a positive, as a gain of doing better. But then it's ridiculous to me that those same people would then malign those that go further.
Right.
And be like, no, we're all trying to move in this direction. So that's how I do it.
In a direction that's positive for the world. I like that. Because that's the goal. We all have to be on team planet here, not team whatever my vested interest is. But again, that goes back to like that human value systems, how we're educated, and all this type of thing. Which is why I think like TFF is so important in the world, because we are working literally with the next generation on the next generation of, solutions. And one of the things that inspires me every year is the fact that I just think we have so much to learn about the inherent ways that young people are, collaborating and innovating to kind of take us into these new directions. And they bring a different value system that is very, very, positive for the world, I think. But we have to obviously navigate this, because it's very easy, especially in entrepreneurship, to get tricked back into the system for, lack of a better word.
Well, it's because, the system is also,
it works. Yeah,
exactly. It's not yet designed.
Yeah.
It is designed for financial it's designed to get positive financial capital.
Yeah.
Right. And this is a fascinating thing. The concept I put forward of we should be aiming for positive impact is a total no-brainer on money.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, oh, of course we should be aiming for positive money. Otherwise your business fails. But the way the system is currently set up, we don't have that same pressure to achieve positive impact on ecological and social outcomes.
Well, you just gave me an idea of a hashtag I'm going to say we should use at our big event in Malaysia, which is hashtag Team Planet. Because I think it's not about fighting for a particular point of view per se, but it's about fighting for the planet and really getting to this positive impact. So I know we're down to the final couple of minutes. I really think you have covered most of the questions that people asked. There was a specific question around poultry production. I don't know if you have any
Sure. Is there a specific question on it, or?
Well, it was just, how do you see poultry production as step one? They are processors, but I also see them as food producers.
Got it. Yeah. Interesting.
I guess that's
I see it. It's a cool question. The role of the processor is to be pushing the producer on the practices that are used in the production. That's where they can have a positive impact. Because as a processor, there's a limited amount. You can get renewable energy. You can make sure you're doing, up to fair trade and living wage for your workers. You can, any waste that's going out of it needs to get, turned into compost in a good way or biodigested or whatever. There's those aspects for you as a processor, but the bigger impact will be pushing and having the conversation with the producers of the chicken to shift them to more ecological ways of doing things. And chickens, it's not the easiest thing to do well, especially with the economies of scale. But there are, so for example, if the chickens were fed my chestnuts as their primary grain instead of corn and soy, then you've got a net positive chicken.
And we see a lot with insects actually too, as a poultry feed, which is
right. Although insects still have to be fed by something else. What are they usually fed by?
Right.
It depends.
Yeah.
So, but yes, insects are a useful part of it. Even better, you have a field of mulberry coppice trees that somebody's raising silkworms on, because silkworms only eat mulberry leaves. You get the value out of the silkworms. But you can then also feed the silkworms to the chickens, and they're an incredibly fast protein pathway as opposed to going through a grain. So there's all sorts of ways, but that's really the thing for chickens too, is the feed. And if you can figure out how to have a positive feed carbon wise, that's really the key to a net positive chicken.
And I think this is a good question to like end on, which is there a website or reference out there for information that gives you like great examples of the highest, best circular economy, case studies and usage?
Well, in food, not yet.
That's where you guys come in.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the things that the circular economy of food community is working on, is towards more iconic examples. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation currently has some of the best stories and sort of collection of materials on it. I would look towards the regenerative agriculture community and the regenerative agriculture and natural products community for examples of products that are heading in this direction. Regenerative agriculture and circular economy have relationships. They are not the same thing exactly. They're working at different levels and with different focuses, but there is some really beneficial overlap. So that's one place I'd look for if you're looking for product examples. Or feel free to get me an email, some which way or form, about the particular area you're thinking of, and I'm happy to.
And I think like this is something too, we can on the Digital Labs share, resources and ideas, and obviously look to you all too to share back with us. Like, this is not a one-way communication here. We also are here to learn from you and your ideas and expertise in this space. I'll just really quick, because she is a flag member, Wendy Lou McGill just wrote into the chat stream that many insects can eat food waste streams, making them poultry or other animal, including humans feed, which is
I agree. Thank you, Wendy, 100%.
Make sure that we hear from all of our flag members. Thank you so much for your time. I really opened my mind to so many things. And I think the biggest takeaway I have is this is not about getting better. This is about positive impact and constantly pushing ourselves to think about how can we have that positive impact. And I really, this was a great session. Thank you so much on behalf of all of us at TFF. And we look forward to continuing to work with you and the other flag members. We're in the final stretch here. So if anyone out there has additional questions, is in need of mentorship, or wants to chat a little bit more about their project, do reach out to Marie, and we will make that happen. But Ethan, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, everybody. Good luck on the projects. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.